do we have members present?
I was just going to say we can do the roll.
Yeah, Chad is not going to be here, so I think you have everybody else.
With Houston on and,
Yep,
okay, great.
there you
Okay.
go. You're live.
Okay, well, welcome to the July 8th HAPC meeting. If you can, let's do a quick roll call. Just, we've got myself, Chris Skoglund. I see Edna. Chad is on vacation. Houston, I believe is here. Corey, Dana, and Sean Wagner. I think we've got everybody and Sam. So can we have everybody had an opportunity to check, look at the agenda? Can we have, if we have a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Second, Corey.
Okay, very good. So moving right along, I know we've got a full agenda this evening. We'll see how we can keep things moving at a good pace with, and please, by all means, that does not mean let's not have some dialogue and conversation about items. So first up on the item is HAPC 2020-06, 28 West High Street, installation of new windows and change of exterior paint color. Scott Webb is the applicant. Sam, you want to fill us in a little bit about this one?
Sure, be glad to. Yeah, this is a request for adding some windows to an existing building that's in the Uptown Historic District, and it's 28 West High. You're probably all familiar with the building. It actually has a historic marker, a historic plaque. Some of you may not be familiar with the plaque program. It hasn't been active in the past few years, but there's about 15 plaques around town that have been placed on buildings as part of a program to recognize properties that have either been preserved through a construction project like this one was, and adapted and renovated, or have some other historical significance. And this is one of those buildings. And so Scott's here tonight, and he can talk a little bit more about his project, but I'll share a photo of the building that he sent to me, just to give you and I think you'll see this red wall. Can you tell me if you see that?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, so I'm showing you the right thing then. So the windows that Scott's proposing on behalf of Tom Kakachis, the owner, will go along this facade. And you might have seen some drawings in the packet that showed other parts of the building along the alley, but that's not actually part of the proposal. That was part of the previous plans. So, and then I will put those drawings up for you as well.
Yeah, it's actually just the second sheet of mine. The A4 drawing is the one that shows the new work.
Okay. I'll maximize that. Is that the right one, Scott?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is an existing brick building. And as you can see, there are proposed 6 openings. And 2 of them in the center are double windows. And so architect Scott Webb is proposing soldier courses up on top of the windows. And these would be, I believe they're, well, I don't know the material. Scott, you'll have to explain that. It's a double hung window, and there would be 8 windows, and 2 of the openings are doubles, and there are no changes to any other parts of the building. So the guidelines talk about window openings having vertical proportions, so this would meet that standard because they're taller than they are wider. And that's really about the only guidance. The other parts of the guidelines do talk about mostly restoration and preservation of windows. They don't talk a lot about new openings. So that's really about the only guidance that you have. This is not a primary facade. It is a secondary facade, but Chris and I, the chair, felt it'd be best to have this discussed at a meeting since there are several openings on a building on High Street. So, and I can turn it over to Commission or Scott for additional information, however you'd like to handle it, Chris.
But if you don't mind, can I just take a moment and share why I wanted it on the agenda this evening? That's all. It was, sent over to me to take a look at to see if we could handle this as administratively. The two things that I kind of picked up on, one is because of the size of it, and it's one of the things from a visibility standpoint. You see it as you approach uptown from the west. It's one of the first taller buildings on that edge. The other thing is just, and it was more my understanding of the fact that from a color standpoint, where I was coming from, and Scott, by all means, share with us, what you think about this, the idea that would we do better to kind of continue the windows, the style of windows and stuff that are on the front of the building, so it looks like it wraps around, as well as the color. That's the items I wanted to kind of bring back to the commission to get their thoughts on it. It's just ideas.
Sure.
Not anything that I was like adamant about or anything. I just wanted to get some discussion.
Well, I think I can just kind of address those two things in particular. I think the picture that you saw, the contrast of that odd color that's up there on that side now, I was told that the intention was they were trying to paint it to look like brick. To me, it's a little weirdly purpley red or something, and really isn't looking like brick, and is a pretty strong contrast to the front facade. Let alone the fact that this is a west facing facade currently with no glass in it, and that paint has been absorbing quite a bit of heat, and overall we just think it's time for a change. So as far as your first question goes, Chris, I would agree, rather than to introduce another new color, maybe just simply take the facade color around the side of the building, so the building appears to be a 3D building and not just painted two different colors on the two different sides. Yeah. With regard to the windows, they would align. Obviously, the floors are consistent throughout the building, so from a height standpoint, they would align with what amounts to what you're seeing there, the third and fourth kind of story windows as they wrap around the side. The heads and sills that are on these are very colorful and fairly ornate. And honestly, we just didn't think it was really appropriate to take that around the side of the building. Typically what would happen in buildings of this era, you would often see even a different brick as the building turned, because they were sort of anticipating it being covered at some point. They often used a less expensive brick on the sides than they might have used on the front. And similarly, the cornice work as it goes around the top, we have, that doesn't really turn the corner. So in my opinion, the side of the building, would historically have always been treated differently. So that's sort of the thought of not repeating these sort of elaborate window heads as they went along the side. That being said, what we're trying to do here is not simply to just put an angle iron, on top of the window to support the brick, but rather to go ahead and put in a soldier course head, like would have been a traditional sort of method of spanning that window head, but without the sort of additional kind of applied trim. And so one of the comments in the section, the window section of the HAPC, says to avoid excessive ornamentation. And to me, if we were to turn that cornice or to turn those windows and try to replicate that down the side, I think it's not really historically appropriate, and would seem a little excessive for the side facade of the building, which, as Sam pointed out in the staff report, may at some point get covered regardless. These windows will at some point likely go
Mhm.
away. So,
Okay.
Chris, one thing I just noticed that I forgot to mention, I neglected to notice it actually. There are some kind of a cast stone masonry down through. I don't know if you can see my cursor. And I don't know, Scott, if that is something that can be highlighted or treated differently. It might add a little bit of three-dimensional interest. I'm not saying painting a different color, but if you could talk to the owner about that as part of this process, I think the HAPC would appreciate it.
yeah, I think maybe, what you're seeing there is the remnants of sort of what I was talking about, where they might have turned the brick around the corner and sort of prepared to kind of tooth in the secondary brick as it went down the side. I'm not really sure that those were ever meant to really be highlighted. They're not like coin corners that sort of, happen on both facades. So I'm not entirely sure what that is. I'm not sure it's something that we necessarily want to highlight.
Okay. It
So-
kind of reminds me of the building that's right next to the city building parking lot where I think they call it the old morgue, but it's a concrete block building right at the intersection of the alley here. And it's like a really early cast structural block where they tried to emulate a stone, but it's really just a concrete block. So
Yeah.
you're right. It's not really a architectural feature.
Yeah.
Are you going to do anything about the bricks that seem to be either missing or damaged that would be, I guess, above the windows that you're proposing to put in? Do you see what I mean?
I do. There's not really a method of patching brick, so to speak, like that. I mean, there isn't a material that's going to adhere to that brick. I mean, that brick is expanding and contracting with the seasons, with temperature and moisture. It just doesn't really patch well. So part of the idea of painting it as opposed to trying to clean it is that the brick is really soft. We don't want that damage to continue. The paint will sort of act as a secondary layer of sealer. And because it'll be latex, we'll have a little flexibility for the expansion and contraction, and hopefully we'll stop it from getting any worse. But it's not like drywall. It's not like or a car. We can't just Bondo that over and get it to stick. It just really won't stick.
Actually, it might look very nice with the windows will kind of draw attention to the history of the, to the wall.
Yeah, and I think too, if I could, the lighter color would lessen where you're seeing those dimples, if I could call them that. I think the darker color just seems to call them out more than the lighter color will. If the owner decides, elects to just use that same color to wrap around.
Chris, I have two questions for Scott. When I look at the architectural drawing, I think you said it was A4. You see the dotted line that slants towards the back of the building, but then there's kind of more of a squared out rectangle. Is that just an old illustration? Were they originally proposing to flatten that roof?
Oh, you mean sort of that cornice line that I have on mine? I've kind of drawn horizontally, but in the picture it actually steps down a little bit.
Yeah, so if you look at the double line on Sam's screen, if you look, there's a double line that's perfectly horizontal, and then the dotted line seems to be what the existing brick is. There's no structural change. That's just use of an old
Yeah,
template.
that was just use of an old drawing. I mean, the dash line sort of at the top of the building just kind of represents the roof slope as it sort of sheets the water to the back.
Okay.
I honestly, until we just zoomed into that picture, didn't realize that it seems like they maybe coursed the coping down a little bit to follow that slope. But no, our intention was not to change that in any way.
Okay, I didn't think so, but I just wanted to make sure I wasn't missing anything. And then I think you did a really good job of explaining the side facade versus the main facade of the building. My curiosity, and I'm not as familiar with this, but I know Chris and a few of us are always conscious of the depth. So obviously the windows, that's going to be slightly beholden to the thickness of the brick and the wall and things of that nature. But above it, the brick soldier, is that going to stick out or just be a flat embellishment?
Yeah, I mean, it would typically just be kind of a flat embellishment on the wall because we are, as I said, expecting that someone, may build up above this at some point.
No, and the irony is, I think you hear us frequently talk about how we do want that contrast and depth, but to your point, to be historically accurate, the sides of buildings are pretty monotone and flat. So I just wanted to make sure I wasn't misreading that.
Yeah, I mean, we were intending to use just use a brick, kind of a roll-lock sill there. So I mean, the sill would obviously stand a little proud of the facade just so it does its job of shedding water and letting that drip. But the soldier course head, I think, should be flush.
And I guess I have a third question. Is there intent to replace the windows on the facade, the main facade of the building, to match, or are these going to be kind of original? Well, I know they're not original. Existing windows and then just 6 bays of new windows.
Yeah, I mean, well, a lot of those windows, I believe, were added with the renovation. They added an entire story up there, right? When they did the renovation last time. So I believe all the windows in the front facade are relatively new.
Okay, so these are just going to be ordered to match or complement. Exactly. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Anyone else have any comments or thoughts they want to share?
How far do the sills protrude on the soldier?
The sill for the roll-lock for the sill?
Yeah.
I mean, it'll be similar to what's shown on the front facade there. I mean, that's not really done for decoration. That's done for purpose.
Yeah.
I mean, that roll-lock is tipped so it sheds water, and you leave it hang proud of the front facade so that the water, drips down it and doesn't just, turn back in under that window.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So it'll be, pretty much like that. That's just a really typical brick sill.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree. Most of the buildings of this era don't have much wrap around from the front as far as ornamentation. Fancy things.
Whoa, okay. So,
well, I heard it through someone else's mic before I heard it through my window.
So, all right.
It's close to me. I don't.
And
Did we say something?
I did have one other question. I think it'd be like white vinyl windows. Will there be any color in the?
Well, I think we're going to match, with that regard, we'll match the ones on the front as far as, the color and the cladding and the grill arrangement, whatever was on the front will continue down the side. So
Okay.
it looks like those are white and they do have
White,
some
yeah.
grills in there.
Mhm.
So,
Sam or Chris, if we make a motion or would we need included in the motion, because we've talked about the complementary nature of the windows and sills and also the paint color, do we need specifics as in they can paint it white or a set of options? What do we need to specify in any vote to help this? I don't want to say move forward, but what is it that we need to make sure is included so that they get what they need and the staff has what they need?
Well, white was mentioned in the written proposal. So if you want it to match the front with the color and the same window materials, except for the sills and lintels, then I think that would be all you would need to say.
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean,
Honestly, when I wrote that as white, I think, honestly, looking at the picture today, I think the better answer is really just to make it match the rest. I mean, we don't want to create another contrast there. So if you want to just have us match the front facade with the color, I'm sure we're fine with that.
Houston and Sean, any comments?
myself, I think it looks pretty good. I think the soldering coursework is absolutely is right on. I believe that probably matching the color for the front would make a lot of sense in this instance, and I think things look really good.
Okay. Sean?
Yeah,
You got-
I would agree. And I
Okay.
think the additional step in bringing the color all the way around makes perfect sense.
Okay. So do any further discussion? If not, I think it sounds like we're all in agreement with the idea of the proposal. It's just having the discussion about the color and the soldier course and so forth. So without any further, do we want to move ahead with the approval? If
Yeah,
so,
I'd make a motion to approve as written up.
okay. So we move with the windows as proposed and bringing the color around from the front. That's good. We hear a second.
Seconded.
Hey, thank you, Edna. Okay. Sam, anything further? You got what you need?
Um,
You got to vote.
yeah, you got to
Oh,
vote.
You got to vote? Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
So you can do a voice vote if you want on this.
Okay. This is Chris. I'm up for, yes. Who's next?
You want me to call him? I'll call him.
You
Ms.
want-
Southard,
Yes.
Mr. Kiger,
I'm a yes.
Mr. Watt,
Yes.
Mr. Miller,
Yes.
Mr. Wagner.
Yes.
Okay. Motion
That's
is
it.
approved. So Scott, I think you got what you need.
Okay, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
We'll see you next time.
Thanks again. Okay, just give me a second here. I'm working two machines trying to keep the agenda straight. Next item up is the pre-application HAPC 2020-08 101 West Church pre-application demolition and proposed four-story structure presented by Norm Butt, the architectural group, the applicant and agent. Sam, you want to give us a little info on this?
Sure, yeah. This is a request from Norman Butt with the architectural group, as you said. And this is actually a pre-application. So there won't be a vote tonight for this, but the reason that there's a pre-application is because of the substantial nature of the project. So as I said in the memo there, anytime there's a new principal building or a demolition of a principal structure, there's a preliminary review to benefit all parties. So it kind of takes the tension off of the decision on that night and allows there to be some dialogue back and forth as far as whether this could move forward like it's proposed, or if it needs some changes, or maybe it's not possible. So those are the different kind of routes it could take. So in this case, since this is a demolition, there is a requirement for a reuse plan in the code because it is designated as a historic building. And as you know, the code was rewritten a couple years ago and then adopted last year and moved into the rest of the land use code, taken out of the historic preservation chapter and updated. And this particular section on the demolition requirements for a building in the historic district was updated. And with this particular property, there was actually a fire damage that happened. So what I think will be something that wasn't anticipated by the writing of the new code is how that fire damage is folded into the consideration here. Because when the code was written, it was primarily focused on how is a building that is old, and in this case, as we designated as historic in the 2018 inventory, how can that be continued to be used and adapted and preserved? But But in this case, since there was a fire damage, and if you saw all of the documents that were submitted by Norm, you could see that there was analysis that's required by the code. And so in a pre-application, you probably wouldn't normally have this much detail from the applicant, but here you do, because they're ready to move forward on it. But that doesn't keep you from reserving some of your judgment until, you know, the next meeting if they decide to move forward. So you're looking at two things. You're looking at what is the demolition, the potential demolition of this building going to do to the surrounding properties and the overall historic district as a whole. You know, what would its loss, what would the impact of its loss have on the community, the district, the surrounding property? And if that loss is something that is substantial, how is that mitigated, or how is that replaced? And so that's when your future decision of the reuse plan or the new building comes into play. So another way to look at it is how is that loss compensated? And so Norm will get into the details of how he's looking at that. So as part of that permission to demolish, one of the standards that's looked at is the cost of actually the upgrading of the property to a what's called a purposeful use. And so we intentionally use that phrase in the code, and it was intentionally vague because we knew that there would be a wide range of potential uses, both in the zoning code and for the economy at the time. And so you'll see, and probably, hopefully you read through the packet and saw that they hired Ferguson to take a look at that from a construction standpoint, and actually went to the extent of separating out what would it be to look at the overall building with all the multiple additions that it's had, or what would it be to look at just the historic part. And the way the code reads is if the cost of bringing that building to a purposeful use, regardless of whether there is any fire damage or not, is more than 50% of the fair market value, then that could justify a demolition. I think they did a good job of providing what I would say is qualified, someone from a qualified market, contractor. You also have the right to ask for another opinion, and we have the ability to retain someone to do that if you wanted to have another review of that. That is an option. The other layer to this, and I'm about to wrap up, is that because there was a fire damage there, we have the benefit of having had the city building official and the city fire chief having observed the conditions of the building and their concerns for the wiring and the multiple additions and sort of the unpredictable nature of how the building might be used in the future and what might be unknown about it. So that's a layer that of course we couldn't anticipate when we wrote the code for the demolition standards. Some of you may recall I brought the fire chief in to update the commission after the event happened. He wasn't able to attend tonight, but is willing to in the future if necessary. So I think you heard from him and his concerns about, if the building is preserved, his confidence level would have to be increased substantially in order to feel that there's not going to be another event that was an involuntary fire. There was nothing that the occupants or the owner did to cause it. It was it's old wiring, and there's been a lot of changes made to the building. So with that, I'll take any questions, or I can turn it over to the applicant, however you'd like to handle it, Chris.
Well, I think it might be beneficial for Norm Butts to just kind of give an overview of, what. Let me back up a second. I think a number of us were there with the meeting, and were aware of the nature of the fire and so on, and the some of the challenges that they faced in terms of even trying to turn the utilities off and so forth. So I went through the material, and I'm sure hopefully others have as well. So I'd like to at least hear a little bit more from the applicant in terms of what are the, what are they looking to, if they were to proceed with a replacement of the building, what are they looking to replace it with, given what the current structure looks like in terms of its, number of stories and size and so forth, what their plans are, and let the group hear those comments, and then we can discuss it.
Sounds good. Should I go ahead, Pam? And Chris?
Yeah, go ahead. And I've also got the Google Maps Street View. If anybody needs it, I can kind of show you the context too.
Okay. If you don't mind, one of the things that Sam indicated is that to help the presentation and maybe help me open up the discussion, which is really the intent of this preliminary, to really have an open discussion about your thoughts, is to maybe share the screen. So I'll do that if that's fine, Sam, at this time.
Yep.
First of all, I know most of you, but I do want to introduce myself, Norm Budd at the Architectural Group. I'm a design principal. I've lived in Oxford since 1985, and my firm is located in Dayton. Primarily, our firm is a pretty broad spectrum design firm. One of us, myself and others, are specializing in historical preservation. We have a number of projects going on right now with historic preservation and restoration, and working with the State of Ohio Preservation Group to do financing and tax credits on that. But primarily, I'd like to thank Sam for putting this together and getting all this information to you, and especially helping out in this process that we're going through. One of the reasons that we've pushed this as far as we have is because we think it's a very sensitive building. Clearly it is a historic building, and we take that very seriously. And one of the reasons that we're here is not that the original intent was to just replace the building, raise the building and replace the building, to build new structure and to build new, create new development in the Uptown District area, historic area. This is really, as Sam said, and as you're aware, is based upon the fire that occurred. And to that end, we wanted to make sure that we were really paying attention to the historical character of the building and what it meant, what it means now, what it meant previously, and what it can mean in the future. So hopefully I will not take too long of a time, but I think there's a lot of information that would be beneficial to understand. So primarily what I'm going to do is go through a little bit of what occurred, how we reacted to that, how Terry brought on my firm, and then also I helped bring on an outside source to kind of do an evaluation. A little bit of history of the building and how the building and the proposed structures or redevelopments might be consideration, and the options that we looked at. This isn't an option of development, of raising the building and development that was taken lightly. It was part of a number of options that were under consideration. And based upon all the research that we did, and looking at all the guidelines and looking at all the Uptown District development code requirements and everything that's involved in life safety, we seriously pushed forward to make sure, especially since the redevelopment and the demolition are so closely linked in what we're looking at right now, that we should really be very thorough in how we're approaching this. And especially knowing that the demolition, if approved, would be moving us into a redevelopment of that. And we wanted to make sure that you understood how we had looked at all of the documentation that we could regarding the building, as well as all of the planning requirements and guidelines and the historical inventory that was taken, and the notes of the inventory, and the reference to the actual inventory code document itself. So those were part of it. And then clearly the cost factor is an issue here. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And then Specifically after that, after maybe there's some discussion about the demolition and that part of it, we'll jump into a little bit more of the design itself. I have a number of papers here that I'm using to kind of guide me along. So I'll be looking down. I apologize for that.
It's okay.
Primarily, one of the things that you're well aware of, and Chief Dethridge talked to us about when we were there. When the fire occurred, I received a call from Terry saying, you know, we really got a problem here. We want to take care of this appropriately. And can you help kind of figure out what the pathway might be for helping put the building back together and keeping the building, or what options we have if it's to a point where it's detrimental to the general public. And from what he had heard and understood in terms of previously having an interpretation from Chief Dethridge of the consideration. So a meeting was held where I met with Terry and Chief Dethridge and brought in Ferguson Construction, who we work with on a number of historic buildings. One of which is the president's restoration of the exterior house, the president's house on campus, and then other projects that we've done. And they're a large commercial firm that does all size projects, and they work extensively with universities. So their understanding of the community, their dedication to community, to university, and then also the work that we've done with them historically. They're a good group to bring in. And they also understand the labor force in any particular location and have a strong control on cost and cost control. So we wanted to bring them in, and we had the meeting, and clearly what we found was, I think, at greater extent than we originally thought, knowing that the fire primarily occurred on the second floor, but affected the whole historical component of the building. The area of the building, which is the historical part of it, is primarily to the north. It represents a footprint of about 1,047 square feet per floor, so about 2,000 and some square feet of the overall building, which is about 5,000 square feet. So it's just represents a small component of all the additions that have been put onto the building. So with that in mind, we wanted to understand what had occurred and how it affected not only the historical building, but the rest of the building. So we decided when we saw what was there, that it really was focused and it really occurred in the historical part of the building. And Chief Dethridge, in his research that occurred at the time and how they had to put out, and what they found was that it was related to the electrical wiring, the old electrical wiring in the walls and above the ceiling. So it was concealed. So this isn't a case of neglect. This is a case of the historical character of this building finally reached a point where in this area it created a problem and fire occurred. What's interesting about that, which I think is part of the reason that there's some real consideration about the danger for the building, is that in this area, the interior part of the house historically has been renovated interior to handle the uses that came about after 1920 as a funeral home. So the historical shell of the building, which is the original component of the building, was pretty much gutted out of all the original configurations, and what was there were the viewing areas and the receiving areas, and then some residential bedrooms upstairs. So it wasn't an area that was heavily loaded with kitchen equipment or funeral home service equipment or anything like that. So it was mainly just living space, open living space for living rooms on the first floor and then bedrooms on the second floor. So to have this occur, it wasn't an occurrence based upon an overloading of equipment. It was really based upon what happened inside the concealed walls.
Mm-hmm.
So that was one of the things that Chief Dethridge was concerned about, was how do you address that in this building? Because even if you were to gut all of the interior structure of the building, you have to take the wiring completely out, pull all the rest of the interior walls down and go from there. So when Ferguson looked at it, there was a realization that it can't just be the upstairs area, but it has to be the whole first and second floor of this historical area. So, and taking wiring back to other locations. So they did a pretty thorough analysis of this, and their analysis came up to, as you saw in the estimate, to about 218,000 square feet. We get to that. I'm sorry, I'll get to that right now. And you can see one of the things that I really requested that Ferguson do is not just give us a number, but give us a breakdown of the scope of their work, which they always do in any project we're working with them on, so that we understand that they haven't overloaded the project or haven't shortchanged the project.
Mhm.
One of the things that this figure represents is only the the addition, the renovation, restoration of the historic component of the building, and taking the wiring back to breaker boxes and things like that. So this represents 218,000 represents, in essence, work on about less than 1/2 of the overall structure that's there. So when we really looked at what that is, we thought, okay, part of the things we have to do to determine if this relates to how it relates to demolition versus non-demolition. With a fair market value of this is primarily based upon what does it take to restore it back to what its original space was before the fire, so that that dollar figure would be the one that could be used as a comparison for the 50%. So what we did is looked at the tax structures, and we had those in your packet, that showed that the building valuation is someplace. The building itself is about 293,000 of the total land and building cost of about 404,000. So clearly this represents a percentage over the 50%, but that wasn't the driving factor to say that everything should come down, that the whole structure should come down, but it's a major component of it. So in terms of the requirements, as Sam has pointed out, that's just one of the items under the demolition approval criteria of the 3 items that are presented there, and then the subcategories of those. So that's just one item. The other items, go right ahead.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
This estimate, and as I was reviewing the material, I think I got the
Yeah.
answer, but I just need confirmation.
Okay.
I think what you just mentioned was that this 218,000, cost is just the historical
Correct.
area.
That's
What
right.
about the other areas of the building? Do we have any idea of the wiring, condition of the wiring? And then would this then integrate well? And are we, at the end of the day, ending up with a situation where the building is electrically sound, and we would, minimize, if not eliminate, the possibility of a reoccurrence of the cause of the fire that took place?
To piggyback Chris, I'm also curious because I believe I was out of town for the meeting the chief came to. What damage exists in the non-historical part?
The non-historical part primarily had a lot of smoke damage,
Okay.
which had occurred throughout the rest of the facility. So that component of work, per this estimate that's shown here, isn't really dealing with the rest of the building. It's primarily dealing with the historic part. Now, where the electric from this portion of the building, one of the things that happened is over the years of renovation of this, primarily from 1920 forward, was all the loading conditions that are required for the servicing and all the kitchen areas and all that, everything was put into the newer parts from 1921, if you can call that newer parts. So this had wiring that was going back to breaker boxes that were modified in the 1920s. So this historical part goes back to some older breaker boxes, and electrically that's going to have to be changed out within the structure, and the lighting connections and all the wiring and everything there going back to those breaker boxes. But there are separate electric boxes that are in the other part that would be untouched. So this is a continuation of electrical in this area, as well as all the way back, that would have to be fished through back to some of the other breaker box locations.
And this is probably more for building and zoning, and not necessarily HAPC, but you would still end up with multiple breaker boxes in the structure. Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, this wasn't included, and maybe it is in the plan, the idea of a full upgrade to the wiring in the existing structure. Okay.
No, yeah, it is not that. So based upon that evaluation, one of the things we started looking at was the options of restoring the building. How is this impact is. removing, in essence, the building itself and figuring out, removing all the additions to the building, because in the past, there were suggestions for meetings that occurred previously by 2005 and 6 that maybe the building itself could stay and be upgraded by and be more historical to the area, to the uptown area, to the historic district by having all the additions removed. And one of the things that I did want to show is some time ago we did take a look at this, and if you look at this color rendition, you can see from the when the building was initially developed in somewhere 1815 to 1846, the original 1850 building was mainly some wood structure, and then major updates occurred after that in 1946, a lot of masonry, and then additions and extensions occurred in 1911 and 1925. And so most of these additions have occurred since the 1925 part, but there are 6 additions. It shows 5 here, but there are actual 6. If you look, and even on the plans that the county has for taxation and planning, it shows all of the additions that have been put onto the building. But actually, where they say this portion right here, the center portion, actually only the front half of this is the historic building, because this is where another addition occurred in I believe 1921, and then this is even a newer addition than that. So they don't have this part broken apart as it's shown. And if you were to look at this, and you look at the aerial on here, I went too far. This is the original component of the building, which is the historic part. So the damage was primarily in this portion of the building only, but all the rest of this was the additions and canopies and everything were brought in at a later date. These weren't damaged, but there was smoke that damaged in the components of this. So this is a garage. The kitchen area is back here. The mechanicals are back here. So there's a real consideration of all the things that occurred to this and how this was primarily focused on just the historic part. So primarily in terms of thinking about this, the shell is retained, but it's had so many additions onto it that it doesn't have its original historic character, which is part of our evaluation. Internally, it has such difficulty in terms of what has occurred because of the electrical fire. And the other component of this is when we looked at the building when Terry was thinking of purchasing it back in 2004, 2005, one of the things we noticed is that, yes, it has that shell, and yes, the interior has been opened up, but this back area that you see along on this side and this side underwent a lot of structural changes because of the nature of these additions to move all of the electrical and plumbing and everything out of this area back into here and open this up to connect. And so at this point too, if you were to say, let's take off all of this structure and try to incorporate that, what we end up with is a shell of the original structure, that the structural back component has to be completely redone. And then internally, we know that everything has to be stripped out of here. So one thing kind of compounds the other. Now in the pictures, one of the things that the demolition review criteria talks about is, I'm sorry, let me get back here. One of the things that the criteria talks about is our structural conditions too. So besides the electrical, besides the cost, you can see here that as it did get up in the ceiling and get into the roof trusses, there's a certain amount of structural that we have to deal with too. So it's not as if this came in as something that was going to give us a lot of opportunity for repair without considerable cost involved. So in relationship to the overall building value of $293,000, this renovation to restoration to get it back to square one is about $218,000 just for this area of the building. One of the things that we looked at in terms of the overall review criteria too, of course, as I said, was what was happening with the demolition component itself. Before I kind of go a little bit further and go into some of the reasons that we then jumped into looking at the other options of raising the building and going to a new addition, do you want to any more comments or questions about the structure of the building, where we are now, and the costs involved now?
Yeah, this is Corey. Chris, if it's okay, I have a couple of
Sure.
questions and or clarifications. So you guys have used the taxable value, but
Correct.
I believe the standard is the fair market value. So
Right.
the taxable value, basically, it goes off the last sale price of the property. So it's, I looked.
Corey, I agree with that. One of the things in owning the building in downtown Dayton and being involved in real estate and architecture for such a long time, the fair market of the value in a commercial consideration where you have either leasing or renting is really based upon the structure and how much it has the capability of generating income. This building has no value or little financial value if it isn't occupied and usable. And that's the case for leasing and office buildings and a number of other things. The valuation of the building on an appraisal is based upon how much of it is occupied, what the rents are, and the length of the rents and things like that are involved. So what we were using was primarily how do we get this building itself back to where it can have the same use that it had before, which means, yes, the fair market value would be not for the property as developed into something beyond this, but back to the fair market value of where the building was before the fire damage. Now, if we were going to say, yes, we wanted to from the very beginning, tear the whole thing down to get to develop another structure, that fair market value is going to be based clearly on what it can generate. But it also goes with the ticket to expend so much dollars to get to that fair market value. So primarily, we looked at this and tried to separate this so that it was primarily looking at the value of this building and its fair market valuation based upon what the structure itself can do as it exists. So yes, the fair market value may be different than what the tax structure is. So that's what we use to start a consideration of that.
And another question I have, because valuation and cost benefit analysis are factored into this, and I realize the purview of HAPC is really on the exterior. So I mean, I think we need to understand the difference or the impacts of moving walls and things of that nature. But the reality is the shell is our domain, if you will. And Sam, you're probably gonna have to correct me on this one because this, I see Sam's ready to unmute. So we're talking about the cost, and I just want to make sure we understand that we're either considering or not considering. This was an insured property, so when we're looking at this, I know regardless of how it's paid for is, that's where the calculations come from, but I also know that the structure had to have been insured to cover the costs and things of that nature. Is that any factor into, because I know from a human emotional standpoint, when I say, hey, Edna, this will cost you $218,000. If I think it's coming out of her pocket, that's a different emotional response than don't worry, Allstate's covering the tab. So I wondered what factors into the monetary equations that has.
So fortunately or unfortunately, we can't add any more to the code than what's there. So all we have is the fair market value, which I think you bring up a good point. We may or may not be able to consider or use the auditor information. The fact that whether it's insured for, let's say, the replacement value or the, the new construction, those are, some people don't update the amount of insured that they have on their property. And so they might have a loss. But, in this case, I don't think that's really applicable. Because that is a private contract that may or may not be up to date. And as I mentioned earlier, this code wasn't written with involuntary damage in mind as far as like a casualty. It was more of a old building that has kind of gradually become out of date, and how do we get it back to a situation where it can be utilized for
for current use, but still keeping the historic look, as you mentioned.
Right, but it's Sam, could I, and Corey, I'll turn it back over to you in a second, but where I'm kind of confused a bit here is prior to the loss, this building had a value. And wouldn't that be the basis versus determining the value of a building that has been now distressed and can't be unoccupied? Of course, the value is going to be less if left as is. But I think when we were working through, because I closely is the fair market value of, at the very least, you'd look at it and say, what was the value of the building before the loss?
That's correct. That's what the approach we were thinking about too, because everything that has to be done would bring it back to that characteristic.
But the
Yeah, I agree with that.
It's about the insurance, because that's kind of like the A plus B equals C. So that's why I asked, because that would hypothetically bring you back to a fair market value of permissible use.
Yeah, the hard part from an insurance standpoint is replacement, because of having been in that business for over 30 years, replacement cost versus market value don't necessarily align.
Yeah. If I could be add something else to this. Clearly, one of the things we've done is we've really tried to review what the guidelines are and what the codes are. And the demolition approval criteria actually says the HAPC may approve a COA for demolition only if one of the following is satisfied. Only if one of the following is satisfied. So the third, there are 3 items. The third one really talks about historic structures and brings into play the 50%. The first one primarily says clear evidence that the structures incurred extensive damage to its basic structural elements, and it goes on roof, foundation, etc. And structure represents immediate danger to the public health, and such damage was not done through neglect. So if any one of the 3 options available, and number one, we're seeing kind of a combination of these 3. The first one, we know that it wasn't done by neglect. It does have extensive value, extensive damage to it that includes structural. It does have, there is immediate danger. It is not occupiable until something is done, as well as there is the financial component, which could be clarified a little bit more in terms of the valuation of that. But when you start to take all that on together, we almost need a little more than just one of those. There's a combination of more than one. So we've kind of looked at it at all of those.
Okay. If I could, Corey, you may have had a few more items you wanted to.
No, those are the primary ones that I had questions on.
Yeah, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No.
Okay. Norm, please continue on. Unless does anyone else have any questions at this time for Norm?
This is Houston here. Do we have any idea what the rents are or were before the fire on an annual basis?
I don't have those, but I can get those for you, and send those forward and make sure that they're part of any future presentation. I don't know offhand. That's one thing that I didn't take consideration is to rents in regarding this.
I believe, Houston, there were 12. There was permitted for 12 is what we have on record. I don't know how many occupied it or what the rents were, but that gives you an idea.
Okay.
I'll move on a little bit. One of the things, when we go beyond the demolition, when we were thinking about the demolition, we were simultaneously saying to ourselves, of course, clearly this is a historic assurance, this can't be demolished without the understanding that what has to go back in its place, or what goes back in place is, one, in compliance with the Uptown District codes, as well as takes into all the consideration of all the work that's been done over the years in terms of giving criteria for reviews such as this regarding design criteria as well as inventory. So one of the things we wanted to do is look at the inventory field report, which we did, the comments posted on that inventory. So there was a field report that was done that was in essence the report that was taken when people walked around and documented it. And I do have a copy of that report. And then the comments that are posted on the actual inventory itself, so we took those into consideration. The review criteria of the certificate of appropriateness also, and then the guidelines itself. And from the submission that I sent to you, one of the things that I highlighted in that, or tried to highlight in that, primarily were the COA review criteria. Number 6 under the review criteria talks about design, scale, texture, visual importance, etc. And so that's why in the very beginning of this, in the letter, I've broken down some of those criterias so that that becomes some of the language that we've used in the conditions we've done when we made the design decisions. So the design decisions really started from the point of knowing what recommendations are for the appropriateness, and then how do we bring some of the characteristics of the existing building to play in this new development. And so that's, I've specifically done this as criteria analysis that is listed under number 6 of the items for criteria.
Mhm.
So when we go down to the building itself, I can go through a certain amount of things that talk about the building itself. This is the existing site. One of the things that I wanted to clearly do for you is we wanted to show what the existing characteristics are of the neighborhood now, specifically on that lot. I think that's really important, especially when we're talking about scale. So as you can see in this, this is the Johnston, I think it's the Johnston House, or the historical Johnston House on Church, and the relationship it has to the existing structure. So there's a little difference in height there already. This is mainly a brick building on the older historic part, where it's concrete block and number of siding elements on the rest of the additions to that. When you go around the corner and you're looking at Beach Street, this is the building that's next door, which is where the theater was, and apartments, and the new development that is occurring here. And it falls within the 4-story development, the development that meets the Uptown District. It's about 40, we did field measurement of this and drew this up, and it's about 40-some feet high, below the 48-foot height requirement. And this shows where this building is here. And as we start to, one of the things that I wanted to do is when I take this drawing and we show these, I wanted to understand, we really wanted to understand what size we're looking at scale, because Uptown District allows for a building to be 4 stories high, 4 stories tall, and be no taller than 48 feet. And so we wanted to, the other thing that I was concerned about this building is it actually is an intermediary. Even though it's in the Uptown District, it's an intermediary between the Uptown District with the allowance of having 4-story buildings with block and brick going all the way up 4 stories, as opposed to the residential character to the north, which I think is really important. And that, do we really want to put a building in here that's going to be 4 stories of block all the top? But I thought it had to be a lot more sensitive to that and have the character of the existing building, but have its 4th floor actually built into the gables and the trusses of the roof system. So it's really a 3-story building with that consideration. So with that in mind, I wanted to understand the scale of things and actually portions. This shows the building next door and the height and the relationship to what we're considering putting here. And there's a reason for the development into components of the building and differences of entryways and differences of things that I'll try to briefly describe. And then on this one, you can see the relationship of the Johnston Historic House in relationship to this building, which in essence follows through with the height of the 3 stories, almost very similar to what this is. And we're replicating this kind of attic space, workspace, occupancy space, very similar, but we're putting it up on this floor here, on this floor also.
So
Now, one of the things,
in essence, you're going up, you're looking at a 4-story building.
a 4-story building with the 3rd floor, with the 4th floor built into the trusses, so it does occupy. Now, one of the things in terms of the evaluation of Uptown District size and scale, the overall building footprint, if you were to go specifically to the Uptown District guidelines, that the development can't be any more than 3, I think it's 3 times the size of the lot. That means this building could actually, according to those guidelines, as just as a factor of itself, would be someplace in the neighborhood of, I think it was almost, let me get my figures here. I'm sorry, I don't want to give you figures that aren't accurate here. Someplace in the neighborhood of 81,000 square feet.
Yeah, so
Um,
what,
I'm sorry.
what I suggest we do is, can we kind of get to, what is it that you're looking for? What are you looking to put in place of the existing building?
Okay, the development in place of the existing building is to develop this footprint of development, which has setbacks, which are in accordance with the code of 16.5 feet off of Beach Street and also Church Street. It currently has a requirement of 0 setbacks on both of the alleys, but we pulled it off of the alleyways a little bit. We're planning on, or having the consideration of putting parking underneath the building, because when you do a building of this size and structure, one of the things you don't want to do is place all that parking out on the street. One of the things, even though there's no requirements under the Uptown District to include parking as part of the building, it's not a requirement. This is considered to be service for the retail, the commercial, the restaurant space that might be happening on the first floor, and then the residential on the upper floors. So the overall consideration is that it has parking underneath that comes in off of Church Street away from the corner. It also has then a footprint which talks about having the setbacks, having plaza area. One of the things that when we did our evaluation, there's the drop from where the 2 alleys intersect from here to here is a 4-foot drop. So you have to start to mitigate that with steps going up in this location, handicap accessibility, and then entryways and setbacks to the building itself.
So
this
Norm,
is-
just
yeah.
so I can kind of, I'm trying to visualize this.
Yes.
What you're pointing to right now, the diagram that's on the right side, not the
Yes.
parking lot side, the right side.
Yes.
Is that the same dimensions of the existing structure, or are you going bigger?
The existing structure, this is the overall lot, alleyway to alleyway.
Right.
This is the existing structure, alley to alley. So this building has a footprint of the residential structure, which is probably in the neighborhood of about 4,000 square feet. The structure that we're talking about has a footprint of about 19,000 square feet.
Yeah, so it's about almost four
Correct.
times the
Correct.
size.
Correct. And one of the things that we're trying to do is in the development, in the design, is to develop it so that it has components of space. If you're looking at uptown development, one of the things, as buildings tie into each other, they have a much more massive continuation of look. And one of the things we wanted to do here was break that apart into components of space and scale that also had representation of the historical elements that were a part of the original building, in terms of the language of the building, in terms of the verticality, in terms of the existing building has, as it's mentioned even in the historic inventory code, has a verticality of 5 bays. This has 5 bays on both corners of both intersections. It has the requirement for separate entryway for residential structures that would be above. That's in the uptown code. More glass and the percentage of glass I mentioned, which is on the first level. So primarily, even though the footprint takes on a 19,000 square foot space, visually on the exterior of the building, we've broken into components. And one of the things that I wanted to show.
Question, is that 19,000 square feet for one level, or is that the total of 4 levels?
That's one level. The first floor, there are restrictions as you go up into the building that the residential cannot have more than 54,000 square feet based upon 2-to-1 ratio of the lot size to the residential. So primarily the residential would have about 54,000 square feet up in the upper level, and then this lower level would have about 19,000, someplace in the neighborhood of 19,000 square feet. Now, one of the things that in terms of the use of this building, one of the things that, we talked to Sam and we asked questions as to what is the need in the Uptown District area? What is the relationship of what's there historically, and how can that be brought into the characteristics of that be brought into this building? masonry on the lower levels for verticality, double hung windows matching the same proportions as the double hung windows on the existing building, masonry only on the first 2 levels with more of a residential character here, instead of putting a building in here and occupying the whole overall site as is allowed, is to mitigate that. But one of the things in talking to Sam is the consideration that there's an understanding or a consideration that the uptown area would benefit from housing and services that were within walking distance of the university and walking distance of uptown for professionals, for university personnel, people, for graduate students. So consideration is, how does that start to impact and be a benefit to the community, which we think it is in terms of thinking of that type of occupancy for people that want to live in a little bit more urban area, but adjacent to a residential area. So the contribution here is beyond what the contribution of the existing building is in terms of just offering residential for students as it is now. But the thought is maybe you could fit into a longer development plan for the community by having uptown walking distance for professionals and graduate students and faculty.
Norm, could I just?
Yeah.
In looking at the size of this,
Yes.
how many, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Houston asked earlier, and I think Sam responded, the existing structure had how many residents?
Potentially, I think Sam answered it at 12, maybe.
12.
It's actually 8. I looked it up. It had a maximum of 8.
8.
Oh,
So,
eight.
so what are you expecting in this structure?
There's requirements by the code in terms of the number of there's in the new code for the uptown business district in this area, that there's a limitation of how many square feet per occupant. So if you take that to the max in this facility, you're maybe up to the potential of 100. And that's 100 occupants, residential and
But you're looking to replace. You're coming to us to share the idea of replacing a building, and I'm kind of at a loss, and others please jump in if I may be the one that's kind of out of whack here, but we were looking at a structure that was there to meet the needs of being a student housing for 8 students.
Correct.
And now what we're looking at is a building that is 4 times the square footage of the historical building. And yet, I would anticipate that you're looking at far more than 8 students living in this new structure. Correct?
Oh, absolutely. Now, one of the things, if the building were to stay as is and on that lot,
Yeah.
it still doesn't mean that these areas around the structure couldn't be developed with that same language or the same consideration.
And I think that would be a separate, correct me if I'm wrong, Sam, that would be a separate, a whole separate submission to develop that property. We're just looking at the building that was there, as in essence, a replacement for the building that existed prior to the fire.
Well, I can chime in here, and actually it would not be a separate submission if there was going to be new construction, because there are some zoning code requirements that we haven't talked about. There is a requirement that I'm getting feedback from somebody, maybe it's from me, but there's a requirement that 70% of the lot have commercial area. So it doesn't mean that it all has to be on the ground floor, but if the lot is, say, 10,000 square feet, which I don't know what it is, but 7,000 square feet has to be commercial somewhere on the property. It could be multi-story or it could be on the ground floor. I'll put in headphones. Maybe that'll help. And there's a minimum requirement for there to be at least a 2-story building. So because the property is all one lot on the deed record, and because of the zoning code requirement, that limits the options for the applicant. If a demolition is granted, then the reuse plan has to
take into consideration what those zoning limits are. Now, certainly it could be divided up, and so that would allow that kind of more of a phased development or spaced out type of development. But as it stands right now, it has to be looked at as one entire quarter block lot from a numerical standpoint for new construction if a demolition is granted.
Okay.
Can I,
Sam, real quick, just throwing on my planning commission hat, which I try so hard not to do, but you opened up Pandora's box. In the Uptown Historic District UP zoning, which this is, to your point, it's 1/4 of a square block. This could be hypothetically divided up into probably, my math is right, 8 parcels. So to your point, we have to consider it how it's zoned right now. They could in the future do that, but then that's still the 70% requirement. So, 10 times 10 or 1 times 100, either way, we're looking at the whole of the same equation. Is that fair to say?
It is, except that individual buildings would look a lot different from a design standpoint. That's not what you have because it's one lot. But as you
Sure.
said, from a bulk standpoint, the numbers are similar.
Okay.
the current, if I could add, the current lot size is 27,267 square feet. With the setbacks, you could be allowed to have a footprint of 22,115 square feet. We're looking at this development with the separations visually of what we have here of a building of about 19,000 square foot. So we're below what the allowance is, even with at the 70% requirement limit. So we're below that. We're at that 70% below that, and below what the setback requirements is even on at this. So visually, yes, it's a larger building with a larger footprint, but what we've done is we've tried to break it into smaller components visually of, as you can see here, and for the Uptown District and the zoning code that relates to that is some of the entranceways are very specific in terms of how they look different than the residential, than the commercial on the first floor. One of the things, if I go through the criteria that is placed about the existing building and talking about the existing building and what the component of this has, the double hung windows, the windows that primarily have a flat header that goes across the top of the windows on the windows up to the 2-story level, that it has a projecting stone sill, that it has actually a consideration of colonnade or columns, very similar to what's on the existing building. Also, the existing building is noted in the historical inventory about having a window area over the entry door with decorative railing. It also has, one of the things that we've done, and the reason I included that picture is currently there's historical decorative railing that exists along the side of the building right now, which we've drawn up, which actually what we're doing is incorporating that into the site all the way along these areas that have to be raised because of the differential. So there's a number of considerations of the way this is looking in terms of its material, its verticality, its balance character as pretty much in terms of the balance of it. So we've tried to break it, and not, even though for the Uptown code for development in this area, it could be 4 stories of solid building. But yes, what we've tried here, I'm hoping that we have been successful at, is how it does reflect some of the character and shape and the memory of the building. Because one of the things that's also in the existing building is gable structure. And so you're starting to bring back in, instead of having the look that we have here, that we really have some type of gable structure that shows up over the, at the entryway and is significant for that. So there's a lot of character elements of this that reflect the items that are called out in historic inventory and talk about what that building looked like and what this
Mhm.
building looked
No, I think we're all familiar with the property and what it looks
Yeah.
like, pre-fire, so.
Yeah.
We get all that. I guess and Sam, help me out on this. I'm looking at the picture that's up there right now, and I don't mean to, dominate the conversation. Others, by all means, jump in. If I look at the structure as I'm looking at on the left versus the new proposed structure, Sam, isn't there a maximum height we're looking at?
So yeah, the maximum height is 48 feet.
Right.
And that is
This
measured
picture's-
to the midpoint of a sloped roof. So the peak can actually go above 48 feet as long as the midpoint from the eave to the peak is below 48 feet. And so when we have a complex roof structure like this, we would have to do some further analysis to see how we would determine, we may have to do some averaging, that kind of thing. But from a general standpoint, if it was a straight gable roof without all the different dormers and multiple
Mhm.
slopes and everything, your peak can actually go above the height limit by
That's what this,
definition of the zoning code.
I did want to purposely put this on here to show that what the building height is at that condition into this speak. So this peak
Mhm.
part of it does go ahead, and also give a kind of somewhat of a condition of if we're 43 feet here, this is, I've measured this, I don't remember offhand, but it might be 45, 46, both of which is still below the 48 feet requirement, a limitation in this area.
You also, Chris, and everyone have a section in the design guidelines that talks about the building height and how it needs to relate to the buildings that are on that block.
Mm-hmm.
So our legal counsel has told us, our previous legal counsel, I don't know about our current legal counsel, but our previous legal counsel has told us that that is essentially a moot statement in the design guidelines, because if the zoning code allows 48 feet, then we have to permit that even if the buildings that are near it are
Yeah,
shorter.
I recall that from other discussions. Yeah. So.
This is Dana. I just have a quick observation looking at this design. I thank you, Norman, for pointing out the Federalist elements, but when I look at it, I see a reflection of the house directly to the west, but I don't see the old, just on a quick glimpse of the design of the old structure. But when you pointed them out, I was able to understand what you're saying.
Yeah, one of the criteria that's in the design guidelines, and if you go through the design guidelines, it talks about on that it has a base, it has as a center part of it, it has a thickness that goes to the cornice and the fascia and all those. And there's also a continuation. One of the things that the existing structure has is it's called out in the guidelines, and it's evident on the building, are the little ornaments that come off of the building at the cornice area, and that's really called out as part of the guidelines in terms of the continuity of how that affects the building. And one of the things we've included that in this building to take on that detail also. And there's also a requirement that there's a recommendation in the visibility of the guidelines that I've mentioned on my report about the height of the first floor being in a range of up to 10 to 12 feet. And per our measurements and what I've shown here, it's the same type of thing. So the proportions of the building match those type of details of the building. Now, to say that this is going to be recognizable as a replacement for the existing building, that's not the case, but the sensitivity to the elements that were on that are showing up here.
I see it more in this view than the other, than the west facing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is west facing. The other one you just showed was south facing, I believe.
Yeah, this is north.
North, yeah.
This is
North.
north.
Okay.
And part of the reason this development here actually wraps the corner. So when you talk about developments in urban areas and you talk about how the corner is treated, this primarily is a corner that is treated the same on both areas. So you're having this as a mediator between the uptown district and up this street, up Beach Street, and then how it commercially pulls itself around the corner. And one of the things that the existing building has, if I go back and just take a quick look at this kind of shows that it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there's a sensitivity to, okay, what does that mean? And when I go down to this elevation, that's the same thing we tried to incorporate, especially, in this building as well as the one around the corner, even this structure, which takes it to the alley, where it has the sequence of verticality with 5 elements. Certain things that we've really tried I really tried to bring into how that matches the uptown urban district with what the guidelines are for historical buildings, and pulling those elements, from the guidelines. So I know there's a lot there to think about.
Yes.
Yeah, and so that's why we wanted to push it further, to really convince ourselves that this pathway, for all the various reasons, starts to make sense for safety in the community, historical references in this building, breaking it down into 2 smaller components and ending up with a large 19,000 square foot block building, and also the community conditions that there might provide housing that is for uptown service and walking distances to the university for professionals and others.
Yeah, and Norma, I appreciate that. I'm just still grasping with the size of the replacement structure. Just
right.
Geometrically, it is so much larger than the structure that that is there today. Yeah. And yet I understand, Sam, that this demolition, it does then bring in, new construction and what can be done as a replacement building. It's just, I'm struggling with the fact that it is so substantially larger than the building it replaces.
This is Houston here again, and I guess I'm kind of curious as to what both the applicant and we ourselves are looking for here. I feel like there's two parts to this. One is the idea of raising the historical structure, and I think that may be our primary point of view at this point, while also secondly taking a look at what the applicant is proposing to replace that structure with. So I guess I'm curious from Sam and the applicant what they want our feedback to be concerning those items, and maybe we can, we're all going to have different opinions on what the replacement is here. I guess I'm kind of curious to find out what they want from us here initially and talk about those things maybe more specifically.
Good point, Houston.
Sam, is there anything you want to offer first on that?
Well, the code doesn't give a specific type of feedback that has to be done in the pre-application. So unfortunately, that does leave a pretty wide open, you can give individual, Chris, you may want to just, after you kind of end the discussion and Norm is wrapping up his presentation, you may just want to just go through and do a round robin. And I will say that Sean did have to leave at 7:15. So for the minutes, he may have to come back, or he said he would try to come back. He sent me a message. So, and if you are moving towards something, and I know I've heard from Chris, but if there's a consensus that, this bulk change is concerning, even though the zoning code sort of requires it, the really only workaround is to, ask the applicant to evaluate whether, dividing up the, the land individual lots is feasible, and, have them report on that at the next meeting. And if that's if you get an answer on that, that is, gives you some feedback that you can work from, then I think, and if it's no, then I think you're back to this or something like this. If it's yes, then I think you're going to be looking at a completely different type of design. So that is the only thing I could think of, since we're kind of stuck with what it is now. And I mentioned the height aspect. So yeah, I would, if I were you, I would just go around and get everybody's individual feedback. You don't have to have consensus tonight, but you do need to, I would appreciate, and I think Norm would too, feedback on the demolition and the loss of the building, and also the appropriateness of the design. And so if everybody could, comment on both of those things, I think that would be enough guidance for the applicant and the owner to decide whether it's worthwhile to continue moving forward or not.
Okay. So,
Well, I was going to say I might be willing to try to kind of start that discussion. Is that a discussion we want to have here right now, or
I don't know if there's more, Norm, you feel you can add at this point. I think you kind of get a sense as to where, where we are, and maybe it is time to start giving you our round robin, feedback in a round robin fashion.
Yeah, for the demolition criteria, part of the demolition criteria is that there's indication, and part of the criteria is what does a replacement look like. This is our consideration of what it would be. And yes, a redevelopment of the lot, but it also indicates following the design guidelines and that are put forth by the design guidelines that are, and an understanding of the inventory. So with the design of this, I think I've been very successful in terms of integrating into this design the design guidelines and the requirements of the design guidelines, as well as meeting the zoning code. So it's my opinion that this meets the requirements for both appropriateness from the design guideline standards, as well as the city building requirements, and it also takes into consideration the Ohio building code requirements and meet those requirements. I think it offers some things beyond that too. One of the things that is part of this is the development of the parking underneath the structure. So it's not as if we're putting all kinds of people in this building and not being responsible and taking the cost on for putting the development underneath. It also suggests that there could be some more on-site parking on the street with maybe angled parking that I mentioned, similar to that's over by the bike shop, which could improve what's happening in the building too. And it starts to bring, one of the things that happens when you get off High Street and you're into the side streets, it has a different flavor to it. It doesn't have the uptown tall historic buildings structure. It has a little different character to it. And part of that is the pedestrian feel. One of the reasons that the building is designed as it is a little bit differently is because, as a commercial structure that can be built on that site, it has the closeness and the proximity of walking up against the building. And that's different than a house where you're primarily walking out of the sidewalk or walking out of the curb. So there's a number of just different elements, but I appreciate what Sam said. And yes, the demolition and the dollars kind of speak for themselves as to what we had talked about before and addressed before. And in terms of the feedback for this building, my understanding, what I'm thinking I'm hearing is, and tell me if I'm wrong, and please each of you comment, that the size of the building is so substantially different. Maybe it has all these elements, but it's so substantially different, it might be problematic.
Houston, do you have anything further? Or?
Sure. I mean, I guess what it boils down to here concerning what my thoughts are concerning the status of the current building, based on what Chief Dethridge told us a few months ago in his talk about the fire and the current status of the building, as well as the photos that were included in the packet that city staff sent out, and some of the other things that were included with the Ferguson estimation on renovation or rehabilitation, basically, of the property to get it back to its previous status. It seems to me, well, I got onto this because I wanted to try to preserve as much historical property and buildings in town as I could. And that's what I want to do. But I guess it boils down to, I think I'm going to be sad to say, I think that this building is damaged in a way that it is going to cost a substantial amount of money to get it back into the function that it was before, a residential rental property for up to 8 students. Just doing some off the cuff math here, I don't know what they were really paying in rent, but I think that the Ferguson estimate to get it back into shape is probably a little conservative, and I expect costs to actually be higher than that to get that thing back into rentable condition. My gut instinct is that the house is probably a loss is where it is, and I think raising it might be appropriate in this instance. And it saddens me to say that. I want to keep as much historical stuff as I can, but at some point things may be just too far gone. As far as the Dudley's initial proposal here to redevelop the property, it's kind of what I expected. And it sounds like some of my cohorts here maybe didn't expect that the Dudleys would attempt to build on the entire property. And I fully expect that they are going to attempt to develop their property to maximize their return as best they can. In that regards, I think that it may be, and we'll need to look at everything that is proposed, but a redevelopment of the entire quarter block in one development might be the best for the Uptown district, in that it would allow for major parking underneath the property, as we saw. If you split that lot up into multiple pieces, you're not going to have that opportunity for a major parking situation underneath. It does seem like a very big building, but I get it. I get what they're trying to do, and it's their property. And I think that they're going to try to develop it as best they can within the guidelines the city sets. And it's not going to be a pretty old building like we wanted, but I hope that they can build something that is a little softer than some of the other buildings that are built in the Uptown district. And I think that the gabled roofs and some of those things will help with that. So that's kind of where I am at with things initially. I'd like to see the whole plan for the property, but from what they've shown, I have to say it is kind of what I expected. It is a lot of building, it's a tremendous sized building, but they have the biggest lot uptown, so they can build the biggest building. That's where I'm at with it, I guess, initially, and I'll be curious to see and hear what you all have to say, and also see hopefully some more pictures and plans and thoughts on things moving forward.
Okay. Corey?
Thank you, Houston.
Well, I've shared a number of my thoughts. I did some quick math, and even on the conservative side, the original part of the building's 174 years old, and that's off to 1846. I'm not surprised, nor do I. To Houston's point, I mean, it is their property and things of that nature. I'm not as stuck on permissible use, things of, if they're allowed to do what they're allowed to do, where and how. I guess I'm most concerned, again, I always weave my planning perspective in, is this is one of the areas that we've talked that starts to fade out. If you look, it's on the edge. It's within a football field of the edge of the historic district. So it is one of our transitional areas to residential. And permissible use, current use, logical use. I mean, there's so many competing entities. This is the first time that probably any of us, at least on this commission, have had to deal with the demolition of such an old building with the the two steps of the new development. So if you think of the last one we talked about, it was a junky old BP station. Who cares? Had no historical significance. Yay, great, it's gone. Brownstone, we're good. So I think that's the complicated layer for me. And I know Norm, and I think he does great work. And one of the things that I think it probably would cost more. I'm very clear on that, but I just think back to what the FIGAM house did. And I know it's a shorter building and it's purely residential, but if for some way there was a way to incorporate or keep, even if it was just kind of a corner, to Norm's point, the 1920s piecemeal 7 editions, they have very little historical significance. They're very functional to a funeral home. They were function over fashion. But I think it'd be really cool if there was a way to incorporate the original structure, even if it was just you know, a piece of a larger building or something of that nature, I think that would be really, really interesting because, like I said earlier, our purview with historical architecture is the exterior, not necessarily the interior. And I think we're all well aware of the limitations, but yeah, my biggest concern is there a way, and again, I'm not advocating this, but I mean, heck, even if you just somehow left the shell of the old building built around it and kind of, I don't know, you always see those things in like New York or St. Louis where there's a skyscraper right next to an older house. And I'm not advocating for that. Yes, I see Chris cringing in his chair. But if there was a way to somehow incorporate it in a way that would work, or put a larger building on that was almost, because you said it's brick. So again, I'm not the architect. I'm just looking for flow into the other parts of the neighborhood and continuity. And again, in a town that's, gosh, what, I'm not going to do the math, 211 years old, to have a building that's one of the first ones. Save it if we can.
Okay. Edna, your comments?
Well, yeah, this is as we've already said, this is the Historic and Architectural Preservation Commission. And what's the potential demolition going to do is the first question, and the impact of the loss. I think that we were so lucky that nobody was killed, first of all. That is just, you know, we're fortunate nobody was killed. But this is a building that really everybody knows, everybody walks by it. There is going to be a lot of pushback if this commission allows it to be destroyed without a few more questions.
Mhm.
I think we should really have a second view about it, a second opinion. You know, $218,000 to renovate doesn't sound like a lot of money to me. I mean, I just did a renovation in my own house. It was expensive. It didn't cost me $218,000, but renovations are expensive. We know that. I just have a lot of trouble with this idea of approving a demolition without a few more questions, without a closer look. I don't think that the proposal, you know, as extensive and probably beautiful as it is, in any way mitigates the loss of this really beloved structure. You know, and again, we know we're only concerned with the outside and the appearance. So I just have a lot of trouble with this. The chief was certainly not very positive about this building, but you know, that was right after the fire occurred. It seems to me we could have another look at it, find a way to, as you say, incorporate the structure in some ways, and make up for the fact that this this landmark might be in some way preserving the historical memory of our community. I think that people are going to be, if I think about the community at large, and you know, as a member of city council, I think that I have to take that into account. I think there's going to be a lot of pushback if this commission just you know, checks the yes box here. So that's where I am. I'm sorry.
Nope,
Thank you, Edna.
That's
Thank you for your comment.
Dana?
Yeah, I did have a question in some of your research, Norman. Was there any evidence of a house between the funeral home and the house to the west? It was kind of like
Yes.
an open space there.
There, some time back, it was approved by the HAPC, and I don't know the exact date, Sam might be able. There were some concrete block structures that were torn down on the intersection of the alleyways. Prior to that, I don't have history of things there. I know that when the structure changed, originally it seemed to be built the first property records indicate about 1815. But the structure, and that was primarily for land. And then there were structures that were built around 1846, this building included, with major modifications at that point. And so there were some wood structures, and on the back corner area to the west, southwest, there was a masonry structure that was approved to be torn down. And the recommendation previous commissions, previous HAPC discussions was that the building would be best served if all the additions were removed. So I'm not sure what else might have been back in that area, because it does represent a very large tooth, as you say, a void. It's in the community there with those large areas. So the thinking would be that there might have been something there. And there was, but I don't think it's older historic structures that were there. I'm not aware of that. Sorry, Dana.
So yeah,
Dana,
I
I'm
understand your case for demolition and for we're with this situation of trying to maximize the space. You've done a good job of trying to incorporate the architectural elements. And yeah, when I looked at that house, that Federalist style, I don't know if any of you have been to Springfield, Illinois. That's the same style as Abraham Lincoln's house. And if we had, to Edna's point, I mean, there is the value to saving that. But then also, I mean, I kind of myself kind of caught in between. What is the real historical value other than just saving that style of house? Or I'm still on the fence as far as considering this case. So those are my thoughts.
Okay.
I've got a map for you, Dana, on the what was there before. So I'll share my screen. I don't know if you've ever heard of Sanborn maps, but they are the in Houston, if you like the old stuff. So you might get into these, but so here's the building we're talking about.
Okay.
This is a 1911 insurance map. And so I think Norm was kind of referring to maybe what was here. Actually, what was torn down in 2005 actually is not even on this map. It was a concrete block, kind of a commercial building. But I think what Dana, you were asking about is what was here.
Yes.
So this footprint is more of a traditional kind of frame house.
Yeah.
Where you can see the porch and everything on it. So it would have been very similar to
Okay.
the Prather house to the west and pretty much everything around there.
Okay.
So yeah.
So we're missing a house in that.
Yep.
Okay.
So anyway.
Well, that kind of like, it's not so much of a, I was kind of thinking there's the case for the transition to residential, but this information shows it goes right into a, single family house scenario.
I don't know when it left existence, but this is from 1911.
Okay. Thank you, Sam.
Mm-hmm.
So I think everyone has spoken. I'll just finish it up. Two things that kind of come to my mind. One is, Houston, I appreciated your comments about the fact that, it is one lot, it's probably one of the largest available lot left uptown and looking to maximize the value that can be attributed out of that building. But then and as you've heard me throughout the evenings, say that, I'm a little bit concerned, probably more than a little bit, over the fact that we're taking a building, we're raising a building and replacing it with something that's 4 times the size and 2 more stories to it. And just how the public perception of that will be and received in terms of the raising of the building, which has had me think about, as others have spoken, as the fact that, and Norm, maybe that this is something that needs to be addressed if you elect to go forward with this, is the fact that the damaged area is in the historical area. Yes, there is some smoke damage done perhaps to the other areas, but we weren't talking about doing any type of that estimate from Ferguson was just the restoration of the historic area.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if it falls within our purview to turn around and say, oh, Well, since you're taking that down, then you can in essence be extended to take down all the other extensions that were built in the 20s and so forth, so that you end up with basically a clear plot of land to work with. I think we have to look at it from a perspective, from a historical, is, looking at, and even that formula of determining, what's it, the cost of demolition versus the cost to repair. The 50%, the more than 50% rule is the idea of within that historic space. And to turn around and restore that, and yet what's being proposed and what I wrestle with is the rationale for removing the rest of the structures that, other than smoke damage, which would be addressed via, paint and some fumigation, whatever. There's nothing structurally wrong with the other additions that were built on that would cause them to have to be raised at the same time. Is there anything that would, and what I would ask you to go back to your client with is the idea that, is there a way to look to, I can understand needing to replace the existing historic structure, and we would look for something that is fitting of that, type of style of building and so forth. But looking at yet also utilizing the existing extensions that were put on, because as you said earlier, the wiring isn't an issue and so forth with that. It's really more confined to the historic section of the building. So that's what I would just ask to consider, and that may indeed bring about from a size of structure, something that's a smaller scale, but might be something more, something that be willing to consider as an alternative. Those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate that. Okay.
So, anything more to share with Norm? Okay.
Chris, I did want to say, just to follow up on Edna's comment, I would need to have some kind of consensus, or I'd prefer to have a vote from the commission if there was a majority that wanted to have a third-party review of the financials, because I don't feel confident, just running with that on my own. I have some people in mind that I could hire to do that, but that would be spending some resources to get that done, and that's part of the reason why the fee is paid for this, to compensate that if we need it. But I would need your backing with a vote in order to do that, and so
I'd make that motion.
okay.
I would second that motion. I would really like to have that information.
Then let's do a vote.
Okay, I will do a roll call then. And I'll start with Ms. Southern.
Yes.
Mr. Miller.
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Kiger.
Yes.
Mr. Watt.
Yes.
Mr. Skoglund.
Yes.
And I believe Mr. Wagner is still absent. And Mr. Smith is not here tonight. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Do you have an idea what kind of a timetable might be involved in such a operation so that the clients could know that?
I don't. I would expect, the reason I wanted you to vote on it is because I would plan to have it done prior to the next meeting. That
Sure.
way, if Norm's client decided to go forward, you would have that at your fingertips and you wouldn't have to wait for another meeting.
Right.
Thank you.
Even though you do have 60 days after the official presentation at the next meeting to make a decision. You don't have to by code, but traditionally you do.
Well, I think we all understand that you always do the very best you can,
Yes. We appreciate it, Sam.
and we appreciate that.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you for spending, I know it's late in the night and so forth, but we appreciate your presentation this evening. Thank you.
We appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks, Norm.
Okay. I know it's running late, ladies and gentlemen, so let's just, I think we have one final item, Sam, and that's the Brook Street. That's still on the agenda.
It is,
Okay.
yes.
The second
And looks
floor
like
pad-
our applicant has rejoined us. So yes, it's 36 East High Street. Mark Wiseman is here with us and has requested, and he's brought his design consultant as well, Bob Riggs, and has requested a certificate of appropriateness. And on this one, we decided that it did not need a pre-application because it's not as major of a project as, for example, the previous case. But it wasn't as minor as something that would be administrative. So this has a one-stop review.
Mhm.
The request, as you saw in your packet, is to take the existing Brick Street building, which was built as a movie theater, is a historic building. It was built as the Miami Western Theater. I believe I have that correct, and it is designated as historic in the inventory. Is to take the outdoor patio that's covered, that has a roof over it, and utilize a similar type of architecture to add a second floor to that, and also extend one bay toward High Street. So I will see if I can share my screen here. Maybe take me a second because of I had some other things on my computer here. Yeah, here we go. Okay. Sorry for the delay. I'm getting there. Okay. So this is the rendering, which includes the change. I don't have one up here at the moment that shows the existing condition, but you are probably familiar with, it's kind of a hip roof structure,
Mhm.
steel roof. It previously had kind of an iron bar enclosure that was removed a few years ago. There were some garage door type openings added on the east wall of the building. So the proposal is to add this second level and to extend what I would call architecture would be another bay to the south. And because this is exterior and visible, as Corey mentioned earlier, it is required to be reviewed. This project is also going to the Board of Zoning Appeals next week because it is within their front yard setback area of 16.5 feet. And there was a variance granted in 2002 to build what is there now. And because the north-south streets in the mile square have that wider setback requirement, whereas the east-west streets uptown do not. So any construction that is in there requires a variance from the Board of Zoning Appeals. So even though a previous variance was granted in 2002, because this would be adding another floor level, we made the determination that that would have to go back again to the Board of Zoning Appeals. There is not a sequential standard in city policy or code where the HAPC has to be before or after the Board of Zoning Appeals. So if an applicant decides to submit both at the same time, and it just happens that the calendar falls that the HAPC is first, then HAPC has to respond. And so we don't know what the outcome of the BZA would be, but your decision is separate from that.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity to show you what we've come up with for the Brick Street Sky Deck, as we call it. As Sam mentioned, there's an existing roof over approximately 1,000 square feet of the existing patio. And what our intention is to remove that roof covering and expose that 1,000 square feet and add an additional 250 square feet, one bay towards High Street. And in doing that, we would not be increasing the footprint of the patio at all. What we would be doing is using the existing steel from the roof structure, having it modified to create the floor deck for the second deck. We would have that inspected and if able to use it, reuse that, cut down because it would be smaller than what the roof structure is. Create that second deck, leave it exposed to the elements, put floor drains in to bring water off of the deck out to the existing downspouts that are there already that carry water off of the roof structure. In doing this, we're adding 2 stairwells up to the second deck, which in doing that takes out about 400 square feet of the space, 200 on the first floor, 200 on the second floor. So in adding the 1,200 square feet on the second floor, overall, we're actually adding about 800 to 850 square feet to the patio itself. As part of the project, we would not be asking for an increase in occupant load for the building. The intent behind this project is to be able to space people out on the patio, partly due to the pandemic that we're dealing with today, is to be able to spread people out, take people upstairs, take people downstairs, but not increase the occupant load of the building itself. What we did on the first floor, you can see right now there's CMU and glass block between the columns. Our intent is to remove that and continue the black railing down Poplar and use that same black railing on the second deck, and then extend the white columns of white painted CMU up vertically to create the supports to handle the deck and handle the railings to support those correctly. We would have a similar color steel angle at the base of the second deck to keep things from rolling off, obviously, but to mimic that black railing so that the Poplar side of the business looks similar all the way down Poplar, and as you look at the High Street side, you have the main entrance of the building, which remains prominent.
Okay.
So, like I said, that's the intent behind the project, is to be able to space people out, give people another option to go upstairs, but not increase the occupant load for the building as is. With that, I'd like to take any questions that anybody might have on how or why we're accomplishing what we want to do.
I'll start. The railings there, I'm assuming you'd follow the similar style you have on the ground floor today
Correct.
for continuity. And I'm just going to assume, you know what happens sometimes when one assumes.
There's 2 words in assume.
Yes, but that the railing height of the second floor, it's more of a life safety issue, would be high enough that you don't have a risk of, someone falling. It's meeting at least the minimum height that needs to be there.
Yes, you'd have to go 42 inches on the upper level to maintain that clearance. And I don't believe the lower level's at 42, so the upper level would have to go to minimum 42
Okay.
to appease the code on that.
Mm-hmm.
So the questions about safety are not part of anything that we're deciding, or not a standard for us. At what point will that be considered and reviewed? I mean, for instance,
My understanding is that in the building, if this gets approved here and gets approved by the zoning variance, then as it goes into the building department would be the one to clarify the railing structure and how the railing performs, and it has to meet a certain code as far as pounds per square inch of pressure from one side. So that would all be taken into account by the structural engineer that designs the railing, and then also through the building department.
I mean, I think the goal of keeping people a little more separate is really, very important, probably for the indefinite future. And so this is a very good plan. I understand that, but of course we also have to be worried about people's, safety and so on. But as the look of it goes, I think it looks pretty good.
Yeah.
I would like to know what other people think, but I don't particularly see a problem with how it looks. in terms of the historic aspects of it. But I defer to my colleagues on this committee.
See, and I actually disagree with you, Edna. From a historical continuity aspect, you know, one of the things we are supposed to consider, and we talked about it on the previous topics. We've talked about it with the Harrison project on College, is continuity to other properties as well as the property it's attached to. And the there's no historical complementary nature or double deck architecture is not complementary to anything in that area. And I do commend, you know, trying to spread out the masses, but I'll be candid. We had a similar discussion with 45 East. These are variances which were approved based on conditions at the time, and X years later, well, one more tweak, and then X years later, one little more tweak. And then what happens is if in 30 or 40 years we look back, well, 20 nickels is still $1. So we didn't have to make a $1 change all at once. We can do it in 5-cent increments. And in the end, we've still, done detriment to the historical nature of the areas. If this does get approved, one suggestion I would have, and again, I understand there's building standards, but this, again, from an aesthetic standpoint, the staircases are on the outside, which is no way, shape, or form complementary to any architectural feature except for a rental retrofit of an old house. So I would encourage that those staircases, again, safety is not our purview, but you can kill two birds with one stone. If the staircases are moved alongside the existing building, it provides for aesthetic resolution, as well as less people flipping off a staircase or crowds at the top of a outside staircase. But again, in looking at the nature of this, I don't think the concept is bad. I just think with the historical facade and things of that nature with the building it's on, as well as, I mean, in the drawings, we can see a church in the background. Across the way, we've had discussions about how the greenhouse, as people call it, on 45 East looks. Complete diagonal is the old municipal building, the police station. So I think there's some merit and some good arguments. I'm having a hard time wrapping around the architectural continuity and historical significance or complementary nature of this.
This is, Chris, what, listening to both Corey, you and Edna both, I'm kind of looking at it from a perspective of, you're right, there is nothing else of similar nature in the surrounding area. But I don't know if we necessarily would hold that against the applicant. Okay, number one. Number two is, I actually look at how they've handled the look of the outside. More the vertical lines, as I see it, actually line up pretty good with what the front of the building has based on that rendering that was just up there. And I think it actually, the treatment on the second floor looks better than the existing slanted roof that's up there now. You know?
Chris, to your comment, the columns that are out on Poplar do actually line up with the columns that are on the Poplar face of the existing building.
Mm-hmm.
So and that's how they were originally done for the existing patio below. So that they were to mimic that all the way down, and then we extended them vertically to kind of create that same look.
I look at this, and the picture that's up there right now, thanks, Sam, is it looks, the existing patio almost looks like an addition. It's so not in keeping with the rest of the nature of the city, the historic look of the city, that I actually think this balcony actually lends itself to be more of a historic look.
Well, also it's the fact that it comes 17 feet or so closer to the corner. Right now we have a two to three bay cut corner, if you will. I'm not a huge fan of the current roof. Doesn't mean they can't replace it with another roof. I just don't know if a double deck solution with an outside staircase that comes 25% closer to High Street is the solution.
I concur with, consider moving the staircases inside so that you, from an exterior look, it's more in keeping with where the railings are and so forth. I get that. From an appearance standpoint, that would be a better move, better positioning of the stairs. So, Houston, Dana, any comments?
I agree with you, Chris. The second floor, second level columns actually kind of at least tries to mimic the rest of the architecture better than it exists now. And unfortunately, a lot of buildings aren't being used for what they are designed for. And that's the case with this building. So I think you're trying to make the best with the practicality of still trying to use the buildings for a commercial purpose.
Mhm.
I think it's an improvement from what we have right now. I did have a question about, did those columns come through this group before that when that extension was put on?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, they did.
Okay. And then did you have any thought of keeping that glass brick or?
Well, the reason we took it out was so that the poplar side of the building kind of mimic itself all the way down. I know that was put in there probably to mimic what's on the main entrance on High Street.
Yeah.
And it could stay. There's nothing that's keeping it from staying there except the fact that we just want to create those horizontal
I just
lines
got-
of the railing.
I like the glass brick. That's just personal preference.
Okay.
I can understand the decision for taking it out.
And the purpose of, if we had the stairs coming down, if we had to have another means of egress out because of the proximity to where the gate is, where our new bay is, that we could put a new gate, just an emergency gate right there at the stairs, since the railing's there already.
Houston, you've been quiet.
Yeah, I don't have a great opinion on this either way. I don't have a major problem with it, so I'd go along with it. I'm very curious about safety standpoints on it, the height of the railing on the upper deck, so that people are less apt to drunkenly flip off of it. I always worry about people throwing things, but that could happen from a patio, whether it's on the floor or on the roof or on the second floor. It doesn't matter. I don't think that the applicant is doing this for any COVID-related social distancing aspects. So I found that to be interesting. But yeah, I'm fine.
It actually is. If I may add to both of you, I know the point that the purpose of this group is not to talk economics, but I've listened to a lot of economics for the last 2 hours. In fact, the last review of that large building, I think, Houston, you asked about rentals and how much they're getting. And so I understand that's not your purview, but it actually is. It actually is part of it. In fact, one of the inspirations for me was quarantining during the initial part of COVID and driving over to South Carolina, where they have a lot of rooftop bars. And I've been to Austin, I've been to other parts of the country where I've seen these. And, one of the things that is always been talked about constantly is the fact that if you can spread people out, get more people outside, there's a much less risk of something happening. So we've been shut down for a long time. I mean, this is a big investment. Again, this isn't about this. I understand that's for another group to talk about the economic component, but it is about a different time than 45 East 18 years ago. We're in unprecedented times, and all the businesses in Oxford are trying to find ways to survive. I think you're going to see many not make it. We're trying to do something that we think adds value to the uptown, has a cool look, generates excitement. And by the way, we hope does create a scenario in which we can spread people out, more people outside, spread them outside the building. We know short term, it's probably less significant because we understand there's a lot of restrictions going into the fall. But whether it's COVID or whether it's anything else, I think the more people you can get out, the more people you can spread out, the safer it is. And for us, certainly there is an economic component.
So this is Corey. One thing I just want to clarify for the record, because I'm that guy. The last discussion did have a legal and ethical requirement to consider the finances. So I think that's different. And you'll find if you ever listen, I'll just speak for myself. Perpetuity is one of my favorite words. So the decisions that were made in 02 about 45 East are pertinent because in this case, it is an adjoining property or an adjacent property, but also it sets a precedent. And that's where my theory of 20 nickels comes from is nobody on the HAPC right now was part of the group that made this decision. So we're somewhat limited from personal knowledge. We have to lean into our staff or the local recollection of other people. So I think that's where our concern is, and where you're hearing, I'm privy from my planning hat to know a lot about the backstory of this even being permitted on what is hypothetically this and 45 East being on the public right of way, so to speak. So that's why I'm saying, if we do this here, it does have ripple effects and things of that nature. And if you ever, I'm happy to talk to you about rezoning property in a planning lens and the ramifications for eternity. So I think that's where we're coming from.
That's where you're coming from, not everybody.
Yeah, let's try to bring this back.
I will.
This is planning. This is HAPC.
I know, but I'm the planning rep to HAPC.
I understand. I understand, Corey, but.
So the other component I wonder is if there is the intent, or if there's not the intent to expand capacity, is the capacity automatically recalibrated, or is that something that the city and fire code would have the ability to do?
You mean it would expand it, increase it?
Well, occupancy is based off square footage and egress access.
Oh, no, I understand that, but we're adding 1,000 square feet. So you're saying we don't want any extra, we don't need any extra bodies. Are you saying they would increase it for us? I mean, that would be nice.
No, I'm asking Sam if it automatically happens or if there's a no thanks, we don't want the extra.
It's up to the building official. So it's not whether you want it or not. So, I mean, I can't speak for the building official, but that's part of the permit review. So as Mr. Riggs said, once the HAPC and BZA are done with their part of the process, if it makes it to the building permit, then, they'll handle it there.
Yeah, that's something we would have put on the drawings, that the intent is for there not to be an increase in occupant load for the building. But as Sam said, that comes down finally to the building official to make that call. And if they say then that the building is going to increase by 20, 30, 40, 50 people based on that square footage, then that's the case. But the intent going into it is to keep it at the same number that it is now.
Okay.
I like the way I like anything that emphasizes or reflects, I should say, the Art Deco style of this building, and everybody who walks by here who is an old timer, we all remember when that was a movie theater. And, I remember I took my kids there when they were little, so it does have nostalgia, and it is important for our community. So I'm glad you are being sensitive to that in terms of the columns and how they look.
Good point, Ed. So,
Thank you.
okay, any more discussion? So do I hear a motion to take action on this? Go ahead, Ed, though.
I so move that
Well, you can approve as presented, you can approve with conditions, or you can deny.
well, I would move that we approve it, but I would be concerned. I mean, it's not part of our work is it to determine how high those gates have to be,
Yeah,
The
How high
so
the railings go.
my
How
comment on
high the-
that, I think it is a relevant question because if what's been depicted is not actually what is required by the building code, if it's less than, or so sometimes a safety requirement can result in an architectural change that is within your purview.
okay.
So if the change is noticeable enough, then Chris and I could look at it administratively and make a determination. Is that something you have noticed from the street? If not, it'll just go through and you'll never see it again. Does that make sense?
Yes, so I
Okay.
move that we approve this pending the fact that the railings will be high enough to meet code and be safe for all the customers who ever come.
Corey, I know you're chomping at the bit probably to make an amendment to that, so
No,
the staircase? You want the staircase? You want the staircases moved?
I make a motion to amend Edna's motion to have the staircases moved to a non-visible area, preferably on the interior of the structure.
Okay, Edna, do you agree with that change?
I agree, but would add that we'll have I think you mentioned earlier, something that allows people to a safe egress from upstairs, a safety railing or whatever, safety case.
Okay.
If all those things work, then we, right?
Corey, could you
Yeah,
explain again your reasoning for that, to have it on the staircases on the interior?
Well, it's majority aesthetic.
Okay.
You know, there's no, it's actually contrary to most architectural designs to have an exposed staircase unless it's a retrofit. And so to move them to the interior would have the flow of the columns be continuous without chevrons. And then also from a safety standpoint, you don't have people congregating at the top of a staircase right next to a 12-foot drop.
And if I might add, the reason why they're out at the exterior at this point is because the overhead doors that were added on the exterior of the building would be encroached upon if we put them against the inside of the second deck. So we could look at doing turn back stairs that go down to a landing and then turn back 90 degrees in the corners, which may decrease the amount that you actually see from the street. But having them against the existing building would, I think, cause more changes to happen, because that's where people come out to this deck already because of those overhead doors.
Yeah, the other thing I would add, I mean, I didn't think of this at the time, and I guess this is something, Bob, we can talk about, but it'd be good to get the group's opinion. We have obviously the skybox, the second level. In the interior of the building, we have 2 sets of stairs that go up to it. I don't know if there's an ability to expand the sky deck enough, the skybox enough to have a walkway to an opening onto the patio, so that you just, and maybe that's not even possible. So I'm just thinking, if we actually had stairs, we're talking about the interior, and maybe I'm not understanding it correctly, where if you're talking about stairs in the interior, you're saying the inside of the building?
Just being against the outside of the exterior of the building, just moving them to the other side of the deck.
Oh, all the way to up against where the garage, okay. Because I was just thinking, maybe there is a way to avoid it altogether and create an access from the inside of the building. And again, I'm talking out loud.
No, and it just, I think your point about the fact that you've got the existing bay doors that go to the first level, if you put a staircase in front of them, it
wouldn't be feasible.
yeah, that's so, Corey, we may need to rethink that.
Withdrawn.
Okay, thank you. So anybody else? Can we take a vote? Do we have a second on the Edna's motion?
Second.
Okay, thanks, Dana. You want to take a vote? Sam, you want to do a roll or just do a voice?
Yeah. I can, which do you want me to do?
Why don't we just do a voice? Okay, all in favor, say aye or raise your hand for the visible.
Aye.
Okay,
Aye.
any opposed?
Aye.
Okay, one opposed.
Okay,
All
one
right.
opposed. I do want to say that throughout this meeting, I've been checking for public participants, and there have not been any.
Okay.
I know you didn't call for public input, but we do have that option, and we haven't had any.
I was going to ask you about that. Should we have read that statement that we were doing when we had in-person meetings, but I know we hadn't been doing them.
Yeah, I've been monitoring it for you.
Thank you, sir.
Mhm.
All right. So the application has been approved. They can go forward. Just Sam, you take it from here.
They can go forward to BZA and potentially building permit.
Good. So
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for your time.
Take your time.
thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So folks, I got to tell you, this has to be one of the record meetings for HAPC, but I appreciate everyone hanging in. I think it was a good discussion and so forth. And given the hour, I don't want to stretch it out any further, except to say one thing. I want to thank Edna for her comments regarding the expansion of the historic district that was made at a recent the city council meeting. I think based on the fact that no one was throwing anything at you, well received.
Not this time.
So I take that as it's a move forward. We will talk about that. We'll get it on the agenda for the next meeting, but I think we've had a pretty full house tonight and we're all getting tired. So thanks again. I call for a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
Okay, Mr. Watt. I'll second that motion and we'll call it a night.
And we thank you for this, your first meeting as chair. Thank you. You've done a great job, Chris.
Thank you.
Chris.
I appreciate
Thanks,
the
Chris.
feedback.
Thank you, Sam.
Yes.
Good night,
Thank you,
everybody.
Sam. Good night.
Night,
Thanks, Sam.
everybody.
Everybody.